Her alpha male told me I had two options: leave quietly or face him like a man. I fought back. I couldn't believe it when I walked in and saw them together. My heart stopped. What would you do if you caught the one you trusted most in the ultimate betrayal? Stay tuned, because what happens next will shock you and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. It was a typical weekday evening, and I found myself alone in my office once again. The familiar hum of the air conditioner was my only companion, as I leaned back in my chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window that offered a sweeping view of the city. From here, I could see the distant glow of traffic snaking through the streets, the headlights blending into a sea of moving lights. I had spent years chasing that view, building my career brick by brick until I could finally afford an office on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. Yet somehow, in this moment, all of that success felt hollow. I had everything on paper, at least: a thriving business, a stylish apartment, and a beautiful wife. But lately, something had been off. The connection I once had with Sophia, my partner in life, had become strained. At first, I thought it was just the stress of our busy lives. She was often out late at events, or catching up on work at odd hours. We'd both become so engrossed in our careers that the little rituals we used to share: Friday movie nights, lazy Sunday breakfasts, had all but disappeared. I'd wave it off, tell myself it was just a rough patch. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. I tried to ignore the signs. She'd started holding her phone a little closer, her conversations a bit quieter. When I asked about her day, her answers became clipped, vague, as if she was struggling to keep up a facade. I told myself it was just work stress or her need for privacy. Everyone deserves some personal space, right? But the truth gnawed at me in the quiet moments. It would creep in late at night when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city outside. I'd glance over at her side of the bed. Sometimes she'd be there, other times not. I wanted to believe in us. I wanted to believe that after all these years, we were still the team we once were. But the unease wouldn't go away. The day it all began to unravel started like any other. I'd spent the morning locked in back-to-back meetings, consulting with clients and making calls. By early afternoon, I was drained. I remember walking into the kitchen of our apartment, looking forward to nothing more than a quick bite and a moment to myself. But as I poured a glass of water, I saw it. Her phone was sitting on the counter, buzzing with a new message. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd left it there plenty of times before. But when I glanced at the screen, a name appeared that made my stomach twist. Daniel Parker. It wasn't the name itself that set me off, but something about the tone of the message. It read, "Can't wait to see you again." My hand froze on the glass, the cold condensation dripping onto the counter. A dozen thoughts raced through my mind, each one louder than the last. I wanted to look away, to put the phone back and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore it any longer. My heart pounded as I unlocked the screen. Her passcode hadn't changed. What I saw next hit me like a gut punch. The messages were there, plain as day. Flirty, intimate, filled with promises and plans. There were pictures too. Nothing explicit, but just the kind of candid, personal snapshots that told a story no words needed to. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. This couldn't be happening. Not to us. Not to the life we'd built together. I'd always trusted Sophia completely. She was my rock, my confidant, the person I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. And now, it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath my feet. I wanted to storm out of the room, to confront her that very moment. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the need to process what I'd just discovered. All I knew was that I couldn't just lash out. Not yet. Instead, I put the phone back where I found it, my hands trembling as I placed it down. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty kitchen, my mind racing. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion that I couldn't untangle. How had we gotten to this point? Had I missed the signs, or had I just ignored them because I didn't want to see the truth? I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. One thing was certain: this wasn't the kind of betrayal you could just sweep under the rug. It wasn't something I could forget with a quick apology or an explanation. This was different. This was real. Sophia came home late that night, like she had so many nights before. I heard the soft click of the front door and the shuffle of her heels as she slipped them off in the entryway. I was sitting in the living room, a book resting unopened on my lap, my thoughts far from the pages. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. I didn't look up as she walked in, but I felt her presence fill the space, heavy and uncertain. She hesitated for a moment, then offered a weak, almost automatic smile. "Sorry I'm so late," she said, her voice casual, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. I simply nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Inside, my mind was a storm, but outwardly, I remained composed. I had made a decision tonight wouldn't be the night for confrontation. I needed more. More information, more clarity, more time to prepare for what would inevitably come next. As the days passed, I kept my suspicions to myself. I forced myself to follow the familiar routines, acting as though life was normal. But the truth was, every small interaction felt like a game of chess. I watched her closely, noting every detail: the way she kept her phone close, the way her answers seemed more rehearsed, the faint tension in her voice when she spoke about work. Each piece of the puzzle was falling into place, yet I couldn't quite see the full picture. What I did know was that Daniel Parker wasn't just some casual acquaintance. He was something more, someone who had managed to weave himself into her life in ways I had never expected. And if he was as cunning as he seemed, this wasn't his first time doing so. I needed to understand who he was, what he wanted, and why he thought he could get away with it. I reached out to Tom, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. He was a private investigator now, a man who thrived on uncovering secrets and exposing lies. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the waitresses called you on, and the coffee came with endless refills. Tom sat across from me, his weathered face lined with experience, his eyes sharp and unreadable. I told him everything, laying it out piece by piece: the late nights, the phone messages, the name that had been flashing on her screen. "I need to know who he is," I said, my voice low but firm. "I need to know everything about him." Tom didn't flinch. He simply nodded, scribbling a few notes on a small notepad. "I'll look into it," he said, his tone steady, giving me the confidence I needed. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." Over the next week, I threw myself into work, trying to keep my mind occupied while I waited for Tom's call. I pored over spreadsheets, held endless meetings, and even stayed late at the office just to avoid going home to the silence that now felt so deafening. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was Tom with news. When the call finally came, I was in the middle of a client presentation. I saw his name on the screen and knew I couldn't ignore it. Excusing myself, I stepped into the hallway, my hands clammy as I pressed the phone to my ear. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through me. Tom's voice was calm but direct. "He's trouble, Andrew. This guy's got a history. I've found records of shady business dealings, a trail of burned relationships, and more than a few people who'd like to see him taken down. He's not just some guy your wife met at a networking event. He's a predator. He finds what he wants, takes it, and leaves a mess behind." The words hit me like a freight train. I had been prepared to hear that Daniel was a problem, but the extent of it was staggering. "How long?" I asked, my throat dry. "How long has he been doing this?" Tom paused. "Years. He's careful, calculated. He knows how to cover his tracks, but not well enough. The people he's hurt, they all tell a similar story. He comes into their lives, charms them, and then uses them for his own gain. When he's done, he walks away, leaving them to pick up the pieces." I leaned against the wall, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "And Sophia?" I managed to say. "What does she mean to him?" Tom's voice softened, but the words still stung. "She's just another piece on the board. He doesn't care about her, not in the way you think. He sees her as a challenge, a conquest, someone he can manipulate to boost his own ego. She's not the first, and she won't be the last unless you do something about it." I hung up the phone, my mind spinning. The picture was becoming clearer, but it was a picture I didn't want to see. Daniel Parker wasn't just a threat to my marriage, he was a threat to anyone who crossed his path. And Sophia? She had fallen for his game, pulled into his web of lies and charm. The anger inside me burned hotter. But it was no longer just anger at Sophia. It was anger at Daniel. At the way he had so easily inserted himself into my life, tearing it apart without a second thought. I couldn't stand the idea of him walking away unscathed, of him doing this to someone else after he was finished with her. But I knew I couldn't act impulsively. This wasn't just about confronting Sophia, or having a heated argument with Daniel. It was about something bigger. I needed to be strategic, to plan every move carefully. I would gather all the evidence I could, not just to confront them, but to ensure that the truth would come out in a way that neither of them could deny. I would expose Daniel for who he really was, not just to Sophia, but to everyone who thought he was untouchable. This was no longer about saving my marriage, it was about exposing the truth, and stopping him from hurting anyone else. The next few days felt like a test of my resolve. Every moment I spent with Sophia was a reminder of what I had lost, of the trust that had been shattered. She carried on as though nothing had changed, smiling at me in the morning, asking me how my day was, as if her world wasn't built on lies. But I couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't let her know that I was onto her, that I was planning my next move. The hardest part was pretending that everything was fine, that I hadn't seen the messages, that I didn't know about Daniel. It took every ounce of self-control to keep my emotions in check, to hold back the words that threatened to spill out every time I looked at her. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about taking control of my own life, about reclaiming the sense of stability that had been stolen from me. Daniel Parker thought he was untouchable, but he had underestimated me. He had underestimated the lengths I was willing to go to protect what was mine, to ensure that he never did this to anyone else. I wasn't just a victim in his game. I was a player now, and I was ready to make my move. So now, the question is, what's my next move? Will I expose the truth, or keep it to myself? Comment 1111 if you think I'll confront them right away. Comment 2224 if you think I'll stay silent and plan my revenge. What would you do in my shoes? Tom's first report arrived a few days later, and it felt like ripping a band-aid off a wound I hadn't realized was so deep. I sat at my desk, the room bathed in the cold, white glow of my computer monitor, staring at the documents and photos he'd sent over. Every word, every image, was another dagger in the heart of what I thought my life had been. Daniel wasn't just some overconfident businessman flirting with my wife. He was a master manipulator, the kind of man who saw other people as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. He'd charmed his way into social circles, taken what he wanted, and left chaos in his wake. And now, it was clear that Sophia was just another one of his trophies. As much as I hated to admit it, she had let herself be taken in by his lies. But my anger wasn't just reserved for her anymore. It was Daniel who had planted this seed, who had fed it until it grew into something that could destroy my marriage. If I was going to make my next move, I needed to be smart. I needed to outthink him. I started documenting everything, every interaction, every offhand comment from Sophia that seemed too rehearsed, every time she left the room to take a call or clutched her phone a little tighter. My smartphone quickly became a logbook of timestamps and notes. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I needed to have all the pieces in front of me before I made my next move. Daniel was meticulous, and if I was going to beat him at his own game, I needed to be even more meticulous. I saved every scrap of evidence Tom found: financial records, text messages, pictures from events where Daniel had no business being. It was all starting to form a picture, a dark and twisted portrait of a man who thrived on control and chaos. The more I learned about him, the more I understood that this wasn't just about an affair. This was about taking down a man who thought he was untouchable. I still hadn't confronted Sophia. Each day that passed without me saying anything felt like walking a tightrope. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lay it all out in front of her. But then I'd think about Daniel. He'd want me to lose control, to make a mistake, to show my hand too early. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. Every time I bit my tongue, every time I forced myself to smile and act as though everything was fine, I was building a stronger case. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It wasn't easy. Some nights I would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the anger boiling inside me. Other nights, I'd sit on the couch, scrolling through the messages on her phone that I'd quietly taken pictures of earlier. Each time I read those words, it felt like reopening the wound, but I knew I had to endure it. I needed to remember why I was doing this. I needed to stay focused. In my quieter moments, I found myself thinking about how this all began. The little changes I'd ignored, the excuses I'd believed because I wanted to trust her. It made me angry at myself too, for not seeing it sooner. But then I'd remind myself that this wasn't just a failure of trust, it was a betrayal. And I wasn't going to let her or Daniel get away with it. It wasn't just my marriage on the line. It was my dignity, my sense of control over my own life. Daniel had taken that from me, but he didn't know it yet. He thought he was still playing the game unchallenged. He had no idea that I was already several moves ahead. As the days turned into weeks, my resolve grew stronger. I watched Sophia more closely than ever. Every time she looked at her phone, every time she came home late without a believable excuse, I made a note of it. When she slipped up, when she let something slip that didn't quite add up, I filed it away in the back of my mind. I was biding my time. Each detail, no matter how small, added to the picture I was putting together. I was becoming someone I hadn't been in years, calculating, strategic and unrelenting. Daniel didn't know it, but he'd awoken a part of me I thought I'd lost. I wasn't the man who had once trusted too easily. I wasn't the man who had believed in a perfect life that no longer existed. I was the man who would make him regret ever crossing me. A week passed, then another. I didn't press Tom too hard. I knew how thorough he could be, and I wanted him to uncover every last detail about Daniel. When he finally called, his voice had that familiar edge, calm, steady, but carrying the weight of something serious. "Andrew, I've got some things you need to see. I'll swing by your office." That simple sentence was enough to set my pulse racing. I paced my office for what felt like hours before he arrived, trying to steady my nerves. The knock on the door was soft, but it felt like a thunderclap. I let him in and locked the door behind him. He carried a slim, black folder under his arm. The way he set it down on my desk, deliberate, careful, told me that whatever was inside wasn't good. Tom looked me square in the eye. "You ready for this?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. He opened the folder and slid a set of papers toward me. "This guy," he said, his tone measured, "is bad news." I took a deep breath and started going through the documents. There were background checks, financial records, and court filings, things Daniel had likely thought were buried or forgotten. But it was the personal accounts that hit the hardest. Testimonies from people he had once worked with, women who had been charmed and discarded, business partners who had been cheated or bullied into silence. Each story painted the same picture. Daniel Parker was a master manipulator. He didn't just take what he wanted. He made you feel like it was your idea all along. And when he was done, when you were no longer useful, he'd leave you with nothing but the wreckage of what he'd destroyed. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "How does he keep getting away with it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Tom or to myself. Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. "He's careful. He covers his tracks. And he's always a few steps ahead of the people he's hurting. Most of them don't even realize what's happened until it's too late. By then, he's already moved on." I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Not this time," I said quietly. "Not with me." Tom pulled out another sheet of paper, this one filled with names. "These are people who've dealt with him before. Some of them might be willing to talk. Others probably won't. But if you want to build a case, it wouldn't hurt to hear what they have to say." I nodded, scanning the list. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but one stood out: Hannah Lane. I remembered Sophia mentioning her a few times. She was someone from her old job, a woman she'd always spoken highly of. If Hannah had a story about Daniel, it might explain why Sophia was so drawn to him in the first place. "I'll start with her," I said. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You sure? She might not be eager to dig up the past." "I'm sure," I replied. "If she knows something, I need to hear it." That evening, I called Hannah. The phone rang several times before she answered. Her voice was hesitant, cautious. "Andrew," she said, her tone laced with confusion. "It's been a long time. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "Hannah, I'm sorry to bother you out of the blue, but I need to ask you something about Daniel Parker." There was a long pause, the kind that makes you think the call has been disconnected. Finally, she said, "I don't want to talk about him." I understood her hesitation, but I couldn't back down. "I get it," I said, my voice softening. "But this is important. He's involved with Sophia, and I need to know what I'm dealing with. The mention of Sophia seemed to catch her off guard. I didn't know you two were still together, she said quietly. I thought. Her voice trailed off, and I could sense the weight of whatever memory she was grappling with. We are, I said firmly. But he's gotten his hooks into her, and I need to know how to get him out. She sighed, and I heard the rustle of papers, or perhaps a chair creaking as she settled in. Daniel he's dangerous, Andrew. Not in a physical way, he's not violent. But he gets into your head. He makes you believe things about yourself, about your life, that aren't true. And by the time you realize it, you've already lost so much. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did he do to you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. He convinced me to leave my job. Said I deserved better, that I was too good for the place I was at. He made me believe he had this amazing opportunity lined up for me. And I believed him. I left my job, burned bridges with people I thought were holding me back, all because he told me to. And then, nothing. The opportunity never materialized. He stopped returning my calls. And when I finally got in touch, he acted like I was the one who had misunderstood. Like it was my fault. By then, my reputation was ruined, and I had to start from scratch. Her voice cracked slightly, and she took a moment to collect herself. That's what he does, Andrew. He gets in, makes you believe he's the answer to everything, and then he leaves you to pick up the pieces. I thanked her for telling me, though it felt inadequate. What she'd described wasn't just manipulation, it was calculated destruction. And now, I had to figure out how to stop him from doing the same to Sophia. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of anger and determination. Daniel might have thought he could run the same play on my wife, but this time he'd underestimated his opponent. I wasn't just going to sit by and let it happen. I was going to fight back, piece by piece, step by step, until he had nowhere left to hide. After speaking with Hannah, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. He gets into your head, she'd said. He makes you believe things about yourself, about your life, that aren't true. It was like a neon sign flashing over and over again in my mind. I kept wondering how Sophia had fallen into his trap. What made her so susceptible to his lies? As much as I hated to admit it, I realized I had been distracted, maybe even complacent. I'd been so wrapped up in my work, in my own ambitions, that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. Sophia had always been independent, someone who didn't need to be constantly reassured. At least, that's what I had thought. Now, I wasn't so sure. I wondered if she had been looking for something more: validation, excitement, or maybe just someone who paid attention in a way I hadn't. As the days passed, I tried to keep my emotions in check, but it was a losing battle. Every time Sophia walked into the room, I felt a rush of anger and sadness that I struggled to contain. I'd catch myself staring at her, trying to decipher if she was feeling any guilt, any remorse. But she carried on as if nothing was wrong, smiling at me, asking how my day had been, cooking dinner like it was any other night. It was maddening. Part of me wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand answers, to make her explain how she could look me in the eye knowing what she'd done. But I held back. I had to play it smart. I had to be patient. It wasn't just about her anyway. It was about him. Daniel Parker. He was the real problem. I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. Couldn't let my anger at Sophia distract me from what I needed to do. Daniel was the one who had pulled the strings, who had manipulated her into believing that he was something he wasn't. He was the one who had treated her, and everyone else he encountered, like a pawn in his twisted game. If I let my feelings for Sophia cloud my judgment, he'd win. And I wasn't about to let that happen. To keep myself grounded, I focused on the evidence I was gathering. Every time Sophia slipped up coming home later than she claimed she would, giving me a vague excuse about where she'd been, I made a mental note. Every time she glanced at her phone, and quickly put it down when she saw me looking, I filed it away. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was a strategy. I needed to keep calm, to play the long game. My emotions wouldn't help me, but facts would. I started to view each interaction as a piece of a larger puzzle. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about building a case so airtight that when the time came, she and Daniel would have no way out. They wouldn't be able to deny what they'd done, or hide behind excuses. The hardest part was the waiting. Every moment I spent under the same roof with her felt like walking on a tightrope. There were times when I thought I might explode. When I had to excuse myself to the other room just to keep from saying something I'd regret. But I knew that if I lost control, I'd lose my advantage. I had to keep my emotions in check. I had to stay focused. The more I observed, the more I started to see the cracks in their facade. There were times when Sophia seemed distracted, as if she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation she'd found herself in. I'd catch her staring out the window. Her face tense, her mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't guilt, not yet. But it was something. Doubt, maybe. Uncertainty. And I could use that. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Sophia was asleep, I would sit in my office and go over everything. I'd reread the messages I'd saved from her phone, analyzing the language, looking for patterns. I'd compare them to the information Tom had uncovered about Daniel. I started to notice a rhythm, a calculated way he spoke to her, as if he were a sculptor slowly chipping away at her defenses. It made my blood boil. The audacity of this man, thinking he could just walk into someone's life and take whatever he wanted without consequence. I clenched my fists so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I couldn't let him win. Not like this. As much as I hated to admit it, I also found myself wondering what Sophia saw in him. What had he promised her that I hadn't? What had he said or done to make her forget everything we built together? Those questions gnawed at me, but I knew I couldn't dwell on them. I couldn't let my jealousy or hurt feelings cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about taking down a man who had made a career out of deception, who had hurt countless people before he ever came into our lives. Daniel Parker had to be stopped, and I was going to be the one to do it. But first, I had to finish putting the pieces together. I had to be patient, even when it felt like patience was the hardest thing in the world. Another week passed, and each day felt heavier than the last. I tried to keep my focus at work, but my mind constantly drifted back to the situation at home. I couldn't stop analyzing every little thing: her tone when she spoke to me, the way she lingered by the kitchen counter staring at her phone, even the distant look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I had spent years learning to read people, and now I found myself using those same instincts on my own wife. It felt wrong, intrusive even, but what other choice did I have? The man I had trusted my life with, the woman I had built my future around, was no longer the person I thought she was. I was staring at a stranger in familiar clothes, and every day I struggled to make sense of it. One night, while she was out working late, I sat in our living room, a glass of bourbon in my hand, staring at the flickering light of the television. The sound was on, but I wasn't really watching. My thoughts were tangled, my emotions churning. How had we come to this? Was it something I had done, something I had failed to do? Had I been so blind to her needs that she felt she had to find comfort in someone else's arms? The questions came in waves, crashing over me, and I had no answers. Just the cold, empty realization that I had let this happen right under my nose. I set the glass down and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. The phone sat on the coffee table, the glow of a notification catching my eye. It wasn't hers this time, it was mine. A message from Tom. Got something. Call me. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the phone, dialed his number, and waited as it rang. When he picked up, his voice was steady, calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Andrew," he said, "you're not gonna like this." I didn't interrupt him. I just let him speak, listening as he explained what he'd found. More messages, more photos, more details that painted a clear picture of how deeply entangled she had become with Daniel. It wasn't just casual flirtation. It wasn't just one bad decision. This was a full-blown affair, planned out in detail, hidden in plain sight. And Daniel? He wasn't just some smooth-talking charmer. He was methodical, deliberate. He had been targeting her for months, maybe longer, slowly pulling her further away from me until she was completely under his spell. By the time Tom finished, I felt sick to my stomach. "So that's it?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's gone." There was a long pause on the other end. "Not necessarily," Tom replied. "But if you're gonna get through this, you need to be smart. You can't just react. You have to think it through." I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand, the weight of his words pressing down on me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my home office, the same place where I had spent countless nights working late, building my business, planning our future. The desk was littered with papers, photos, and notes, everything Tom had sent me. I picked up a picture of Daniel, one that Tom had taken outside some swanky downtown bar. He looked exactly like the type of guy you'd expect: expensive suit, perfect smile, the kind of charisma that could convince you the sky was green if he tried hard enough. But behind that charm, there was something else. A coldness. A calculation. I could see it in his eyes, even in a still photo. He wasn't just playing the game, he was playing to win, no matter who got hurt. And he thought he'd already won. That realization hit me hard. He thought I was just another clueless husband. Someone who would eventually find out and either look the other way or quietly walk away. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to walk away. I wasn't going to let him have the last word. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the evidence. I pored over every text, every picture, every financial record Tom had dug up. I studied the patterns, the timing, trying to figure out how he had worked his way into her life so completely. And the more I looked, the more I realized how deliberate it all was. He hadn't just stumbled into this, he had planned it. From the first time he met her at some networking event to the late-night texts that slowly turned personal, he had been playing a long game. And for a while, it seemed like he was winning. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I was no longer the man he thought I was. I was no longer the man who believed in the image of a perfect life. I was something else now. I was someone who was ready to fight back. I started to think about the confrontation, how it would play out, what I would say. Every scenario ran through my head, from a quiet, controlled conversation to a full-blown explosion of anger. But no matter how I imagined it, one thing was clear: I needed to be in control. I couldn't let my emotions take over. If I did, he'd win. He thrived on chaos, on turning people against each other, on making them act out of desperation. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. I had to be calm, measured, and unrelenting. I had to make him realize that he wasn't dealing with just anyone. He was dealing with me. The confrontation came faster than I expected. One evening, Sophia was out again, and I could feel the tension in my chest building with each minute that ticked by. I didn't know where she was or who she was with, but I had a pretty good guess. I sat in my office, staring at the folder Tom had given me, trying to decide whether tonight was the night. I'd finally bring everything to the surface. I knew I had all the pieces. I knew I had the truth. But part of me hesitated. Once I opened that door, there was no going back. The life I had known, the life I had built, would be gone. What lay beyond was unclear, but it wouldn't be the same. And yet, I couldn't let this continue. The lies, the betrayal, the manipulation, it had to end. So, I waited. When she finally came home, it was late. I heard her heels click on the hardwood floor, the soft rustle of her coat as she hung it by the door. She moved around the house quietly, as if she didn't want to wake me. But I wasn't asleep. I was sitting in the living room, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for her to notice me. When she turned and saw me there, her face betrayed the briefest flicker of surprise before she quickly covered it with a smile. "You're up late," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. It made my stomach churn. How could she stand there and act as if everything was normal? As if she hadn't been out with him? I felt my fists clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to approach this carefully. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Long day?" "You could say that," I replied, leaning forward slightly. "How about you? Where were you tonight?" Her smile faltered, just for a moment. "I told you, I had to work late." "Right," I said slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "Work." The room was silent, the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on both of us. I could see her shift, her hands fidgeting slightly at her sides. "Andrew," she started, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I'm really tired. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I dreaded. "No," I said, my voice firm. "We need to talk about it now." Her shoulders tensed, and she looked away, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Not this time. "I know, Sophia," I said, my voice quieter now. I know everything. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned back to face me, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. What are you talking about? I know about Daniel, I said. The name hung in the air like a bomb, ready to explode. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw the truth flash across her face. But she quickly masked it, shaking her head. I don't know what you think you know. Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off. Don't insult me by pretending. I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos. I know where you've been, and who you've been with. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Finally, she looked away, her hands trembling. It's not what you think, she said softly. Then tell me, I said, my voice cold. Tell me what it is. She didn't answer. Instead, she sank down onto the couch, her head in her hands. I don't know how it got to this, she whispered. I stayed where I was, watching her, waiting for her to continue. I didn't know what I expected her to say: an apology, an explanation, maybe even an admission of guilt. But what came next was something I hadn't anticipated. I just needed something different, she said, her voice barely audible. Something exciting. Something that made me feel alive. My jaw tightened, my fists clenching at my sides. So you turned to him? I said, my voice sharp. You chose him over us? She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't like that, she said desperately. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I snapped. You hurt me, Sophia. You broke our trust. You threw everything we built together away for what? A few cheap thrills? She flinched at my words, but I couldn't stop. The anger that I had been holding back for weeks, months, was finally spilling out. Do you have any idea what you've done? I said, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what it's like to come home every day and feel like a fool, knowing that the person you thought you could trust more than anyone is lying to your face? Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. I shook my head, my chest heaving. Sorry isn't enough, Sophia. Sorry doesn't fix this. I turned away, pacing the room, trying to regain control. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding. I didn't know where to go from here. I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said behind me, her voice choked. I felt so lost. I didn't know how to tell you. So you just decided to cheat instead? I said bitterly, turning back to face her. You decided to lie, to betray me, instead of having a real conversation? She didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I wanted to feel something: anger, sadness, anything. But all I felt was numb. I had spent so long preparing for this moment, imagining what I would say, what I would do. And now that it was here, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was anything left to save. The truth was out. There was no more pretending, no more hiding. But where did that leave us? I stared at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything, and I didn't recognize her anymore. The person sitting on that couch wasn't the Sophia I had married. She was someone else. Someone who had made choices I couldn't understand. Choices that had shattered everything we had. The room was silent except for the sound of her sobs. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stood there, trying to figure out what came next. I stayed standing as Sophia's sobs filled the room. I wanted to move, to say something, anything to fill the hollow space between us, but I was frozen. Every word she'd spoken rattled around in my head, crashing into each other like cars on a foggy freeway. I needed clarity, something solid to hold on to, but all I had were her tears and the aching, gutted feeling in my chest. The woman sitting on that couch, crying into her hands, wasn't the Sophia I knew. I didn't know who she was anymore. Her face was familiar, her voice the same, but the choices she'd made had transformed her into a stranger. I couldn't reconcile the woman I'd married, the one I thought I understood, with the one who had just admitted she needed something different. Different. The word lingered, bitter on my tongue. She had thrown away years of trust, of love, for something different, and I couldn't help but feel like a failure for not seeing it coming. My legs felt heavy, like they'd been filled with cement, but I forced myself to sit down in the chair across from her. She was still crying, her shoulders shaking, and I just stared at her. I wanted her to stop, to look at me, to say something more. But what could she possibly say now that would make any difference? What could she say that would fix the damage? I ran a hand over my face, trying to gather my thoughts. I felt like a man standing in the wreckage of a house fire, looking around at the charred remains and wondering where to start. Everything was gone. Everything had changed. When she finally looked up at me, her face was streaked with tears. "Andrew," she said, her voice trembling, "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear, I never wanted any of this to happen." I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Then why did you let it happen, Sophia? Why did you let him in? Why didn't you come to me if you were feeling lost, if you needed more?" She shook her head, her lips quivering as she tried to form a response. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. And he made it so easy." "Easy," I said, the word coming out like a hiss. "It was easy to lie to me? Easy to betray me?" She flinched at my words, and I immediately felt a pang of guilt. I didn't want to hurt her, not like this. But the anger, the betrayal, was too much to hold back. I had spent so long building a life with her, trusting her, and she had thrown it all away for something easy. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, and looked her in the eyes. "Sophia, do you have any idea what this feels like? To sit here, knowing that the person I've shared my life with, the person I trusted more than anyone else, has been lying to me? Do you have any idea what it's like to find out that the life you thought you had isn't real?" Her tears started again, and she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but I couldn't. My hands wouldn't move. My heart wouldn't let me. The air between us was thick with everything we weren't saying, the questions I didn't know how to ask, and the answers she might not have. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think. But the truth was, I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know if moving forward was even possible. When I opened my eyes again, she was looking at me, her face full of pain and regret. "I know I've ruined everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't know how it got to this point. I don't know how to fix it." Her words hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know if this could be fixed. I didn't know if I could ever look at her again, without seeing the lies, the betrayal. I didn't know if I wanted to try. All I knew was that the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was gone, and in her place was someone I didn't recognize. In the days following that confrontation, the house became impossibly quiet. I would hear her in the kitchen sometimes, shuffling plates around, but we barely spoke. The air between us felt as heavy as a lead blanket. I had no appetite for her explanations or apologies anymore. She tried, a few times, to approach me, but her words came out hollow, and I found myself walking away before she could finish. What could she possibly say to undo the damage? My mind was made up, and even though part of me hated it, I knew I had no choice. Whatever trust had existed between us was gone, and no amount of tears or promises could change that. I spent most of my time at work or in my home office, keeping myself busy, but my thoughts always drifted back to the situation. Every detail replayed in my mind, over and over, like a song on repeat. I'd try to focus on a client meeting or a project deadline, but then I'd remember her voice trembling as she confessed. I'd think about all the nights she'd come home late, all the excuses she'd given. The weight of it was unbearable. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal, and the harder I tried to keep my head above water, the more it pulled me under. No matter how many times I told myself I was better off without her, the pain didn't go away. The love I once had for her didn't just disappear overnight. It lingered, like a phantom limb, always reminding me of what I'd lost. There were moments quiet, late-night moments when I wondered if I could ever forgive her. Not for her sake, but for mine. Carrying around that anger, that hurt, was exhausting. I didn't want to be that man, the bitter, vengeful husband who couldn't move on. But forgiveness felt impossible. I would look at her, see the person who had shared my bed, my life, and all I could think about was Daniel. The name alone was like a punch to the gut. Every memory we had together was tainted by his presence. Every happy moment now seemed like a lie. I couldn't even look at our wedding photos without feeling sick. The thought of ever trusting her again seemed absurd. And so, I didn't. I kept my distance. I avoided her gaze. I slept in the guest room. I told myself that the marriage was already over, and I was just waiting for the pieces to fall apart completely. Then, one evening, she walked into the living room while I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the muted television. She stood there for a long moment, and when I finally looked up, she had tears in her eyes. "Andrew," she said quietly, "I know I can't fix what I've done. I know you'll never forgive me. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking for a second chance. I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." I didn't say anything. I just watched her, waiting for the anger to bubble up again. But it didn't. I didn't feel much of anything anymore. Her words didn't sting like they used to. Her tears didn't move me. I felt numb. I realized then that I had already let go of any hope for us. Whatever love had remained was now buried under layers of disappointment and distrust. After she left the room, I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen without seeing it. I thought about what she had said, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, maybe closure. I didn't want to carry this burden anymore. I didn't want to keep punishing her, or myself, for what had happened. But I also knew that I couldn't stay. There was no future for us. The damage was too deep. I needed to start over, to find a way to rebuild my life without her. I didn't know where that would take me, but I knew I had to try. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of her betrayal. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't say anything to her as I left. I figured she would understand. I wasn't trying to hurt her anymore, I was just done. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I was finally breaking free from the cycle of pain and resentment, and sadness for the life we had built and lost. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I had. And now, I had to figure out what came next. Looking back, I think I always knew that things would end this way. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no explosive fight that shattered everything at once. It was a slow, painful unraveling. And in the end, all that was left was the decision to walk away. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal from what happened, or if I'll ever be able to trust someone again. But I know that leaving was the right choice. I know that staying would have only caused more pain for both of us. As I settled into my new place, a small apartment downtown, I started to focus on myself for the first time in years. I threw myself into my work, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, and started taking care of my own needs. I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to make other people happy, that I had forgotten how to take care of myself. I wasn't there yet, but I was taking the first steps. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it on my own terms. And that's how I turned the tables. But here's the real question. Was it worth it? Do you think they got what they deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Share this video, and don't forget to subscribe. I can't wait to hear what you think. This experience taught me that trust and honesty are the foundation of any relationship, whether personal or professional. When trust is broken, it's not just the connection between two people that suffers, it's the entire fabric of our communities. In a society that values integrity, we must hold ourselves accountable. Lies and betrayal may seem small in the moment, but their ripple effects can damage families, friendships, and workplaces. To rebuild trust, we must lead by example, be truthful, take responsibility for our actions, and hold each other to higher standards. Only then can we create stronger, more respectful communities.